In the early summer of 1941, the German Wehrmacht believed they had already won the war in the East. Their Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks had sliced through Europe with surgical precision, and they expected the Soviet Union to crumble in weeks. But as they pushed deeper into Russia, they hit a wall of steel they didn't know existed. The encounter with the Soviet T-34 and the heavy KV-1 sent shockwaves through the German high command. For the first time, German shells were bouncing off enemy armor like pebbles. The Panzer Panic had begun. Hitler's response was a demand for a weapon of absolute dominance, a machine that would not just participate in the battle, but would dictate its terms from miles away. The result was the Panzerkampfwagen 6, a name that would soon be shortened to a single, terrifying word: Tiger. When the Tiger I first rolled onto the battlefield, it wasn't just a tank, it was a psychological shift in the nature of armored warfare. At 54 tons, it was a massive, boxy titan of Krupp steel that looked like a moving fortress. While the T-34 was built for speed and sloped geometry, the Tiger was built on the principle of raw, unyielding thickness. Its front glacis plate was 100 millimeters of face-hardened steel. In 1942, there was virtually no anti-tank gun in the Allied or Soviet inventory that could penetrate it from the front at standard combat ranges. This created a phenomenon known as Tiger Terror. Allied tank crews began to report seeing Tigers everywhere, even when they were just facing upgunned Panzer IVs. The mere rumor that a Tiger was in the sector was often enough to stall an entire armored advance, as commanders realized that attacking one was essentially a suicide mission. But the true heart of the Tiger's lethality wasn't its armor, it was its reach. The Germans had taken the legendary 88mm Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun, a weapon designed to swat bombers out of the sky at 20,000 feet, and modified it to fit inside a tank turret. This became the KWK-36. It featured a high-velocity barrel and some of the finest optics ever produced by the Zeiss Company. In the vast, open plains of the Eastern Front, the Tiger could engage and destroy Soviet tanks at ranges of over 2,000 meters. At that distance, the T-34 was effectively blind and helpless. A Soviet crew would see a flash on the horizon, and a second later, their tank would be a funeral pyre of twisted metal. They wouldn't even see the enemy that killed them. This sniper capability changed the geometry of the battlefield. The Tiger didn't need to maneuver or hide. It simply sat on a ridge and picked off anything that moved within its 2-mile kill zone. The engineering inside the Tiger was radical as its gun. While most tanks of the era were cramped, loud, and operated with heavy iron levers that required a bodybuilder to shift, the Tiger was a laboratory on tracks. It was steered with a steering wheel and utilized a semi-automatic pre-selector gearbox. It was famously easy to drive, described by some crews as being as smooth as a luxury car. It was powered by a massive Maybach V12 engine that roared with the sound of 700 horsepower. Every weld was perfect, every hatch was counterbalanced, and every internal component was a masterpiece of German craftsmanship. But this pursuit of perfection was a double-edged sword. The Tiger was not a weapon of mass production, it was a weapon of artisan engineering. While the Soviets were slapping tanks together in open-air factories in the Urals, the Tiger was being painstakingly assembled in clean, high-tech facilities in Kassel. It was a machine that demanded constant attention and a dedicated team of master mechanics to keep it running. Yet, on the day of battle, none of that seemed to matter. when Michael Whitman, perhaps the most famous tank commander in history, took his Tiger into action at Villers-Bocage, he demonstrated the sheer, terrifying potential of the Iron Beast. In a matter of minutes, he decimated an entire British armored column, leaving a trail of burning wreckage that proved the Tiger was the apex predator of the European theater. It was a machine designed to be invincible, and for a brief, flickering moment in the middle of the war, it truly was. It represented the ultimate expression of German military philosophy, that a single superior machine, manned by an elite crew, could overcome an endless sea of inferior enemies. As the sun set over the battlefields of 1943, the Tiger stood as the undisputed king of the steel monsters, unaware that the very weight of its own excellence was beginning to pull it toward the abyss. The era of the heavy tank had arrived, and the world would never look at a battlefield the same way again. It was a beast of legend, a nightmare in steel, and a machine that forced every Allied soldier who heard its engine roar to wonder if today was the day they would meet the Reaper in the form of a Tiger.
While the Tiger I was the undisputed king of the open battlefield, the very engineering that gave it such terrifying power was also the seed of its eventual destruction. To understand the collapse of the Tiger legend, one must look beneath the thick armor and into the complex, almost obsessive design of its chassis. To distribute the immense 54-ton weight of the tank without it sinking instantly into the soft earth, German engineers developed the Schachte Laufwerk, or interleaved road wheel system. This consisted of a series of large steel wheels that overlapped one another in multiple layers. From a design perspective, it was brilliant. It provided a remarkably stable platform for the high-velocity gun and ensured that the ground pressure remained low enough for the tank to move across varied terrain. However, the Russian winter had no respect for German brilliance. On the Eastern Front, the thick, viscous mud of the Rasputitsa would pack itself into the narrow gaps between these overlapping wheels. During the freezing nights, this mud would turn into solid ice, effectively welding the wheels together and locking the tank in place. In the morning, Tiger crews would find their invincible monsters paralyzed. To make matters worse, if an internal wheel was damaged by a mine or mechanical failure, the crew had to remove up to 9 outer wheels just to reach the one in the back. In the middle of a war zone with enemy shells falling and temperatures 40 degrees below zero, this was a logistical nightmare that turned every minor repair into an agonizing multi-hour ordeal. This complexity extended to the heart of the beast, the Maybach HL-230 engine and its sophisticated transmission. The Tiger was pushed to the absolute limit of what 1940s metallurgy could handle. The transmission was a marvel of pre-selector technology, but it was incredibly sensitive to the strain of moving 54 tons of steel through deep mud or up steep inclines. If a driver was too aggressive, or if the tank was pushed too hard for too long, the final drive gears would simply shatter. Unlike a Soviet T-34, which could often be fixed with a heavy hammer and a bit of grease, a Tiger with a blown transmission was essentially a static pillbox. Because the tank was so heavy, towing a disabled Tiger required 3 standard German recovery vehicles hooked together in a massive, vulnerable chain. Often, when the German lines were forced to retreat, crews were ordered to destroy their own tanks with internal demolition charges because there was simply no way to move them. It is one of the great ironies of the Second World War that more Tigers were lost to mechanical failure and lack of fuel than to enemy fire. This leads to the staggering reality of production numbers. War is ultimately a game of industrial math, and the math was stacked heavily against the Tiger. It took nearly 300,000 man-hours to manufacture a single Tiger I. To put that into perspective, the Soviet Union was producing the T-34 in a fraction of that time, utilizing simplified designs that allowed them to flood the battlefield with thousands of units. Between 1942 and 1944, Germany produced only 1,335 Tiger Is. In that same window of time, the Allies produced tens of thousands of Shermans and T-34s. The Tiger was a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic catastrophe. It could win almost any one-on-one engagement, but it could not be in 10 places at once. Allied commanders eventually learned that they didn't need to build a better tank to beat a Tiger. They just needed to bring more tanks than the Tiger had shells. They developed swarming tactics, where 4 or 5 Shermans would sacrifice themselves to distract the Tiger, while one would maneuver into the rear to hit the thin engine armor. Even as the Tiger's reputation grew to mythical proportions, the German industry was suffocating under the weight of its own ambition. Every Tiger was practically hand-built, meaning that spare parts were rarely interchangeable between different production batches. A Tiger in North Africa might have different small components than a Tiger in Normandy, making the supply chain a chaotic mess of specialized parts. By late 1944, the shortage of fuel was the final nail in the coffin. The Maybach engine was a thirsty animal, consuming massive amounts of high-octane petrol that the Third Reich no longer possessed. We see the end of the giant not in a glorious final charge, but in long columns of abandoned steel left by the side of the road, their crews walking home on foot. The Tiger I had become a victim of its own perfection. It was a weapon designed for a war of elite, lightning-fast victories, but it found itself trapped in a war of attrition that it was never built to survive. Yet, even as the last Tigers were scrapped or left to rust, their influence remained. They forced the world to realize that the era of the light, mobile tank was over, and the era of the main battle tank had begun. The Tiger I remains a haunting reminder of what happens when engineering excellence ignores the brutal reality of the factory floor. It was a titan that stood tall and struck fear into the hearts of an entire generation of soldiers, only to be crushed by the sheer, unyielding weight of its own complexity. It was the most famous tank ever built, not because it won the war, but because it showed the world exactly how much power and how much tragedy could be forged into 54 tons of steel.
The legend of the Tiger Eye is often told through the eyes of the men who feared it, but the true story of its downfall was written by the men who had to build and maintain it. By 1943, the German industrial machine was locked in a desperate struggle between the desire for quality and the absolute necessity of quantity. The Tiger was the ultimate expression of the former, a weapon that defied the logic of total war. To understand the catastrophic failure of the Tiger's production cycle, one must look at the assembly lines of Henschel and Sohn in Kassel. Unlike the American Ford plants or the Soviet Tankograd, which utilized the brutal efficiency of the moving assembly line, the Tiger was built using stationary assembly. This meant the tank stayed in one place while teams of highly specialized craftsmen moved around it, hand-fitting components with the precision of watchmakers. While this ensured a level of quality that was unmatched by any other nation, it meant that the production rate was agonizingly slow. At its absolute peak, the factory was only capable of churning out about 100 units a month. For every single Tiger that rolled off the line, the Soviet Union was producing 25 T-34s. The German High Command was effectively trying to win a flood with a very expensive umbrella. This industrial bottleneck was compounded by the German obsession with constant modification. In a modern mass production environment, you freeze a design to ensure that every part is interchangeable. The Germans did the opposite. Over the 2-year production run of the Tiger I, there were hundreds of minor and major design changes. They changed the commander's cupola, the air filtration systems, the wheels, and even the thickness of the roof armor. While this meant that a Tiger built in 1944 was technically superior to one built in 1942, it created a logistical nightmare that crippled the German supply chain. If a Tiger broke a specific gear in its transmission on the Eastern Front, the replacement parts sent from Germany might not fit because that specific batch of tanks had utilized a slightly different tolerance.
This turned the German motor pools into graveyards of perfectly good tanks that were simply waiting for a single, non-interchangeable bolt or bracket. But the most glaring failure of the Tiger project was the over-engineering trap. Nowhere was this more evident than in the transport of the tank itself. The Tiger was so wide that it exceeded the standard dimensions of the German railway system. To move a Tiger by train to the front lines, the crew had to perform an exhausting ritual. They had to remove the massive combat tracks and replace them with narrower transport tracks. They also had to remove the outer row of interleaved road wheels just to fit the tank on a flat car. Once they arrived at the railhead near the front, the process had to be reversed. This meant that before a Tiger even saw a single enemy shell, its crew was already physically exhausted from hours of heavy labor, and the mechanical components were already being stressed by the constant removal and reinstallation of vital parts. Furthermore, the Tiger was a logistical glutton. In an era where the German army was increasingly reliant on horse-drawn carriages for supplies, the Tiger demanded a high-tech support network that the Reich could no longer sustain. It required specialized heavy-duty trailers, massive mobile cranes, and thousands of gallons of synthetic fuel. By 1944, as Allied bombers pulverized German refineries and rail hubs, the Tiger's support network evaporated. The Iron Beast was slowly starved to death. We see reports of elite heavy tank battalions possessing 45 tanks, but only having enough fuel and spare parts to keep 5 of them operational. The rest were relegated to being static bunkers, or more often, were simply abandoned and blown up by their own crews during a retreat. The Tiger was a weapon designed for a world where Germany controlled the skies and the roads. In the reality of the late war, it was a stranded giant. The tragedy of the Tiger was that it was a tactical masterpiece trapped in a strategic vacuum. On the battlefield, it could perform miracles. There are documented accounts of Tigers taking dozens of hits from Soviet 76mm guns and simply driving away, the crew inside barely rattled. But these tactical victories were meaningless in the face of the industrial tsunami coming from the east and the west. The German soldiers loved the Tiger because it kept them alive, but the German generals grew to hate it because it drained the lifeblood of the army. It consumed the steel, the fuel, and the skilled labor that could have produced 5 or 6 Panzer IVs, which might have actually filled the gaps in the crumbling front lines. The Tiger I became a symbol of the Wunderwaffe delusion, the belief that a handful of magical weapons could overcome the industrial might of the rest of the world combined. It was the most over-designed, over-engineered, and over-hyped machine in the history of warfare, a magnificent failure that proved that in the end, the factory is a more powerful weapon than the gun. As the production lines in Kassel were finally liberated by Allied troops, they found unfinished Tiger hulls sitting on the floor, monuments to a philosophy of war that had been crushed by the very mass production it had looked down upon. The Tiger had not been defeated by a better tank, it had been defeated by the assembly line.
By the final months of 1944, the shadow of the Tiger I had grown larger than the tank itself, but the reality on the ground was one of a fading titan. The fourth and final chapter of the Tiger's story is not one of industrial might or mechanical perfection, but of a desperate, grinding struggle against the inevitable. As the Allied armies squeezed the Third Reich from both sides, the Tiger was forced into a role it was never intended for, a mobile firefighting brigade. The German High Command would rush small groups of these heavy tanks from one collapsing sector to another, hoping that the mere presence of the Tiger name would stabilize a broken front. But the era of Tiger invincibility had ended. The Allies had finally done what the Germans thought was impossible. They had evolved. The Soviets had introduced the IS-2 and the T-34-85, while the British had fielded the Sherman Firefly with its deadly 17-pounder gun.
The tiger was no longer the only predator in the jungle. It could now be killed from the front, and the hunters had become the hunted. Tactically, the tiger was now fighting a war of shadows. Gone were the days of sitting on a ridge and picking off enemies at 2,000 meters. In the close quarter fighting of the French hedgerows and the ruined streets of German cities, the tiger's massive size and slow turret traverse became a death sentence. Allied infantry, armed with bazookas and piats, could hide in the rubble and wait for the iron beast to lumber past, striking at the thin side armor or the vulnerable engine deck. The tiger, once a symbol of German blitzkrieg, had become a trapped animal. Yet even in this twilight, the tiger produced some of the most extraordinary combat records in military history. Commanders like Otto Carius and Kurt Nispel racked up hundreds of kills, using their intimate knowledge of the tank's optics and armor to hold off entire Soviet tank brigades for days at a time. This was the last stand of the professional Panzerwaffe, where the sheer skill of the crews pushed the failing machines to perform feats of endurance that defied logic. But the true end of the tiger came not from a shell, but from a dry fuel tank. By 1945, the German logistical system had vanished. The sight of a Tiger I, the most powerful weapon of its age, being towed by a team of farm horses because there was no gasoline left, remains one of the most poignant images of the war's end. In the final battles for Berlin, Tigers were dug into the ground up to their turrets, converted into stationary fortresses because they lacked the fuel to move or the spare parts to fix their broken transmissions. When the Red Army finally stormed the Reichstag, they passed the charred remains of the last Tigers, blown up by their own crews, to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. It was a silent, ignoble end for a machine that had once made the world tremble. However, as the smoke of World War II cleared, the Tiger I refused to disappear into the scrap heaps of history. It began its second life as a legend. It became the benchmark against which every modern tank would be measured. The Western Allies, haunted by their encounters with the Tiger, obsessed over creating heavy counterparts, leading to the development of the British Conqueror and the American M103. The design philosophy of the Tiger, the idea of a main battle tank that combined heavy armor with a high-velocity dual-purpose gun, became the foundation for the Cold War giants like the M60 Patton and the Chieftain. Today, there is only one running Tiger I left in the world, Tiger 131, housed in the Bovington Tank Museum. Thousands of people travel from across the globe every year just to hear its Maybach engine roar, a sound that once signaled the approach of death on the Eastern Front. The legacy of the Tiger I is a complex tapestry of engineering genius and strategic delusion. It remains a warning to every military designer that a weapon is only as good as the factory that builds it and the truck that fuels it. It was a machine that was too heavy for its bridges, too complex for its mechanics, and too expensive for its country. But it was also a machine that captured the human imagination like no other. It represents the ultimate intersection of power, beauty, and terror. To look at a Tiger I today is to look at a moment in time when humanity pushed the limits of steel and fire to their absolute breaking point. It was the apex predator of a world gone mad, a titan that died with its empire, leaving behind a name that will be whispered as long as history remembers the sound of clashing steel.